Welcome to Your Brand Amplified, the podcast where we interview marketers, publicists, and brands to learn their stories, what makes them tick, and tips and tricks that make a difference. I am thrilled to welcome Casey Cavaliere to the show. He has been in the music industry for over 20 years, touring over 30 countries with your band, The Wonder Years. Thousands of shows, hundreds of songs, millions of streams, Billboard charts. Now you are also podcasting. What do you not do? So, Casey, thank you for coming in. I know that what you're going to share is a lot about how you help artists and how you've seen your own career work with all of your marketing acumen. But everything that you're going to talk about, I know, is applicable to any business owner who wants to take different strategies. They might not be exactly the same, but I think a lot of them are going to be the same and resonate. So thank you for being here.
Oh, absolutely. Thanks. What a lovely introduction. I appreciate that. Okay.
Gotta have some fun.
That's right. It's always funny when I put the numbers all together. And I know a lot of people, I used to be one of them as well, are not great at speaking to their accolades and or accomplishments, But yeah, it's very funny, especially with this. When I put it all together, I was like, God, it makes me tired. It makes me feel that, like, I guess I did do that in like 30 plus countries. I'm sure I probably didn't put like Luxembourg on there. So, you know what I mean? Like something probably slipped through the cracks too when I did that math a while ago. But yeah, so you hit it on the head. I have spent the majority of my tenure in the music business at large as an artist, touring, recording, writing, and generally speaking, what I kind of realized and that's brought me to conversations and shows like this is the fact that, you wake up one day and you realize, oh my God, we're a small business. We've built a business, right. And I'm sure you start to realize that along the way, but it's not always the way things are framed early on when we, as teenagers, decide to hop in a van and go hit the road for like 2 months across the US playing shows to not very many people, depending on the show and how far back we're going, right? But the wonderful part about that is you do learn a lot of lessons, both about yourself personally and about the music, your product, and ultimately your band and the kind of brand that you create. I was having a conversation with someone earlier that is the kind of brand that's strong enough that actually ends up being able to pull you through an entire pandemic when the world economy and touring specifically, which as anybody that has a friend or even just a weekend warrior like musician will tell you that touring is pretty much still the primary revenue driver for any career artist, somewhat genre depending. Of course, there are plenty of additional bright, flashy streams out there, especially in the digital sphere, right? But for us as a rock band that thrives on a high energy live show and that kind of really pretty serious, like old school experience of community of putting a couple thousand people in a room together, all yelling the same lyrics, right? That's really important. So when all that went away, it was kind of a nuclear detonation to how myself and a lot of other artists and everyone involved in every corner of the industry was able to deal with it. And lo and behold, I was very lucky to find out, and even with all that uncertainty, that we felt like we had built something, a relationship with our fans and with people that have listened to us for decades. That's something that they are willing to be there to make sure you can continue to do that because, they appreciate what we had done as a band across our career. So it was really incredible. And it was also like a wild case study right in front of our face of like, hey, aren't you glad you did it the right way instead of trying to like maximize profit too early or like figure out how to make an extra buck or two off somebody that's, just getting really curious and maybe starting to get close to your band. And we've always led with our heart and led with a pretty incredible wealth of honesty in what we do and how we talk about everything from shows to early on. If somebody, was kind of offering like a show, to put us on that ended up being like a pay to play where you have to sell tickets. A lot of younger local bands might be familiar with this phenomenon. We would call some of that stuff out if it was happening and would speak our mind, whether it be a festival, in our industry that was really doing something that we didn't agree with. And we made some choices and tried to keep our values at the center of what we did, and I think what we found out is it did pay off in terms of building that kind of brand. So yeah, I'm very excited to get into any and all of that as well and see how it can help anybody in any kind of small business or with any kind of project and mission that they're on right now.
Yeah. Well, I love that you stated that you didn't realize it when you started, but you really did build a business and you built a brand. Because I think so many times as entrepreneurs, and that you are an entrepreneur, we start off doing something because we see a need or because we want to do it, something that we're passionate about. It doesn't mean we're starting out to actually start a business. Like I know the start of the pandemic for myself, I was freelancing. I just moved from Houston back to LA, was kind of restarting, remake my connections here, and ended up just getting lots of referrals and building an agency accidentally, not because I meant to. I didn't set out like, I'm going to build a marketing and PR agency. It was more like, oh, okay, they want to work with me. Yeah. Okay. They want to, oh, I better start hiring people. And so it built up and kind of snowballed. And I think that's one thing that we saw during the pandemic is a lot of the way we did things had to change. A lot of the impulses or the ways that we started things had to change. But you had an established brand, you had an established business, you had built-in fan base. You'd already built these things up when the pandemic started. And then we saw people moving to like Twitch and doing Facebook shows and I know a small record label in Ojai who started doing like variety shows on YouTube because they had bands on their label from all over the world. And so they're like, here's a new music video that they shot remotely by themselves on the beach. So what about
creative? Yeah.
I mean, it's all marketing and it's all still figuring out how to connect to your consumers and your audience and continue building that up. So I have a lot of questions, but we'll start there since we just started talking about pandemic.
Yeah.
What are some of the things that you had to do to still keep in connection with your audience? And do you feel like that helped them bring them closer to you? And are you touring now? Because I mean, I'm really excited that I've been able to go to shows again.
Yes.
So.
So we have done a couple headline tours now. Thankfully, the process and logistics of all of those look a little different, right? The precautions, even, a year ago, when the first time we went out for a full headline run, were decidedly different, trying to stay cautious because it can really complicate things. And there was a lot of investment and, money on the line, but also safety for everybody, band members, crew, extended family. So we also didn't want to have someone catch COVID and then it across the country, right? But so coming back looked a little different. And unfortunately, the touring industry, again, is hit and is in no way like back to 100%. That looks a little different too for a number of reasons that I'll spare everybody, the details of right now. But, suffice to say, it's a bit of a supply and demand thing. Some venues were not able to survive the pandemic and things like that. But in terms of, we were in the midst of that touring lull, reaching out, a lot of bands tried to get creative and say, what do we have at our disposal? How can we do this? And I think it's an interesting thing too, because a lot of people had to go exploring for new possibilities, new skill sets, and do it really quickly, right? I mean, even personally myself, some people really gravitate towards loving to see themselves and being performative on a screen, and creating content and building entertainment in that way. I was never really not as drawn to it, but I think I'm just a little bit more of naturally an introvert in an extroverted fashion, really. And so one-on-one is where I really thrive, which is interestingly enough, when it came to the pandemic, what I realized was, everybody started going virtual, and that allowed me to end up exploring the skill set of artist coaching and mentoring because it was something that I could do virtually, right? And just like that, our band, began very quickly strategizing how we could take it to the live stream performance. What spaces could we use? And luckily, we had built up some really great creative friends and allies, other videography companies and front of house engineers and people that had studios, had spaces that they were willing to open up safely, and do these broadcasts. And I can't even begin to explain how many technical challenges come along with all that. Well, then also trying to figure out a fair and just way to potentially monetize it, understand, that this is not the typical Wonder Years experience that you are used to, right? So we had to approach it from a bit of a different way where there was no way that you can replace the hot, sweaty, like loud, like incredible environment of a rock show with an acoustic seated, very sterile performance, right? So we had to lean into, okay, let's make it sound really good. Okay, we realized this and kind of doing this fourth wall break of like, hey, this is weird for us too, and I think that was an interesting thing too, where some of the feedback that we got from a lot of people that did tune into some of those live streams was that, hey, I loved just seeing you guys and realizing that you were living through this too.
Oh, yeah.
And that you were trying, and that you were like trying for us, and it was in an interesting way. And that not in like a disparaging, like, wow, that was terrible. But in like, again, it was an honesty thing where people saw us once again, I think, as people and said, hey, this is not just a band, not just some, like kind of faceless corporation or brand, which a lot of times there's like an old school rock and roll mystique of like, I don't really know anything about the singer or anything about them. We already knew we were there, but this kind of really just supercharged it, where if you can have your fans see the humanity behind the art you're creating and realize that the things you're saying are coming from a place not that dissimilar to where they might be or where people in their circle are, it's a real quick shorthand to getting someone on board and taking another step, listening to another song and going kind of down that extended, like hand in hand friendship walk where eventually, they might become a lifelong supporter of you, and there's ways you can run a lot of marketing lingo in there in terms of like lifetime customer value. But really the pandemic showed us, hey, aren't we glad that every time we made a decision at every point along the way, we had our audience in mind and their best interest in mind, because now they really see that. And now we really see that they knew that, each time, and they had it built up and they were willing there, not that we were falling, but they were willing to catch us just as much as we were trying to play for them to just distract them for an hour on a Saturday night in the midst of this hellish uncertainty. So yeah, a lot happened, but I think that was, trying to go out and take a leap, right? Because it was the perfect time. And if you tried something new, and this is an interesting where it might be more applicable to, I'm sure, a lot of other listeners that might not be in music or entertainment directly, it was this almost golden opportunity. And I'm a big fan of Stoic wisdom. So it was kind of one of these like the obstacle is the way thing, where if you are willing to look at this and say, this is an opportunity right now to try something that on other circumstances I would literally never try. If it doesn't work, I can blame it on the pandemic.
Yeah.
If it does work, well, maybe I had it in me all along. I don't know, and it just, I had some time to let it out. Right. So I think that is one of the big takeaways that we saw as well, and that I saw personally. And that's where now, many years later, what I had started to kind of do as a producer in the studio, having some, like 1 hour additional extracurricular conversations with artists about how they release, the music properly, how they could kind of promote it, how they could start to build out the brand around what was in the record we just made. Into a whole other arena where I realized, I guess I've become a bit of a Swiss Army knife of, resources by living in the middle of, kind of every side of the creative process in music. So yeah, it learned a lot for sure, but
Well, I think one thing we all saw, no matter if you're a band or a brand of any other kind, product, service, whatever, that we just really put a lens on people want authenticity and they want to feel connected. And the more that they feel connected to you, the better you'll do, no matter what you're doing. Because if you're a coach or you're selling widgets or whatever, what are you doing differently than everybody else out there? And how are you making sure that you're continuing to cultivate those connections authentically and genuinely? And that was a huge factor. We saw big brands fail. We saw little brands do really well and get big during the pandemic because they had those authentic connections.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's it. And, in terms of scaling a business and scaling a brand, it's the same thing. When you're a band playing to 5 people, you're kind of just there and have no other choice than to just be like, yeah, you guys, what do you think of the set? I'm standing here and you're the only other person in the room right now. Well, let's have a conversation, right? So it's very easy to read the people and get that kind of feedback and be on the pulse of it. But when you're a band playing to like a couple thousand people a night or more, it starts to get a little harder, right? And I think that's, there's some interesting theories and ideologies about how bands get to a certain level, and does the art resonate as well, and or why, because they're not necessarily in the same circles or living the same life or kind of filling up their tank with the same inspiration from a day-to-day, like this just happened when I went into the coffee shop kind of thing, And I think that's a big thing for us too, where part of it has been just living it, I'm lucky that we have built an incredibly valuable thing that can support us and sustain us. But by no means are we locked away or isolated, with incredible wealth and global, like Taylor Swift U2 Bono level fame, right? And it's actually interesting that I have come to appreciate the small semblance of almost like anonymity when I might need it, because it's actually a strength in a way that I find, especially from a branding and marketing standpoint, because I can still understand, especially like as one, there are 6 people in my band, right? So sometimes it's an interesting thing where I'll be like sitting at a bar or a restaurant, like right next to the venue or down the street from the venue, and I can overhear like a table behind me that won't realize like talking about going to the show, and in like deep conversation about the new record that we just put out, what this song was, and they like the ones that were done at this studio versus this one, and like, does this lyric mean this? I'll walk out of there and be like, so glad you guys like the record. Also, I wasn't sure about the 7th song.
Gosh. And then they're like,
wait, what? And then one of them would be like, I'm not sure, but maybe that was the guitar, And so it's actually really interesting too, not in like a voyeuristic way, but in like, I still think that there's a strength in never losing that, like that ear to the ground and being able to experience it, because that's the best way to get in tune with your audience and the best way to make sure that whatever you're putting out there translates as you, whether that's your website or your online persona or the world you build on Twitch, right? And the choices that you might make around what your backdrop is or where you choose to do it and what time you choose to do it based on who really wants to watch it then, right? So
I'd love to talk about some of the techniques, because I'll give you a little case study. Yeah. I was working with a 15-year-old unsigned singer-songwriter from Philly. She was a musical theater person, wrote songs with her dad. During the pandemic, they shot a video on his phone.
Okay.
But they went to studio to make a song. They're like, we're going to release it on YouTube. My boyfriend's a film editor, so he edited it together, made it look, really cool. And they didn't have anything because, again, like she's new, she knows she wants a long career, but she's just starting out. Some of the techniques that we saw work, and this is during the pandemic, really effectively were he knew somebody who knew some people. And so Ellen shared it on her socials, the song. It's called Lonely Christmas by Wallace. I'll just do a little plug for her.
Okay.
Now she's going to be a freshman at USC next year in the music program. So I was like, let's share it on some local groups, like our neighborhood groups on Facebook, because it's a song that will really resonate with people right now. Somebody in there was a big Reddit person. So he shared it on Reddit, got it to go viral on Reddit. So within like 3 days, we had over 100,000 views on YouTube. And then we started getting requests from all these shows. And it was really crazy. I feel like it was the right thing at the right time, but also just putting it out there and getting in front of people digitally really helped. And then we could sit back and go, okay, what's the strategy moving forward? They're like, we're going to play a long game. She's 15. We don't need her to be signed. We don't need her to do the voice. We don't need all these requests. We're going to make sure that this is a career she can have forever and that she really figures out who she is first. And you mentioned that you started when you were a teenager. So I guess there's 2 things to this, or maybe more than 2. But one is, what are some of the strategies you saw? Because you also alluded to the fact that music has changed and the way you promote music and streaming and all these different things. So what are some of the other tactics that you see working really well? Are any of them like the Reddit, the YouTube, having fans or fan groups or different things like that? Yeah. And then the other part is starting out as a teenager. Was this band just for fun to start? And then you said, oh, this is actually, we can make a go of this. And like, how did that develop?
Well, so I'll start with the latter of those 2 questions because that's an easy one. Yeah. Yes, in no way was intended to be a multi-decade spanning career. In fact, it was a complete joke. We showed up, wrote a parody song about our distaste for Route 9, which runs through New Jersey. There's always been like a, kind of Philly PA rivalry or Philly Jersey rivalry.
Hey, I love Ocean City.
Right. Me too. That's where I grew up going, actually. So I throw no shade at Ocean City, with the exception of that very lighthearted parody song that we wrote and assumed we would all, go off to college and what have you. And so it wasn't for about 3-4 years through college until we started really thinking like, hey, we are having fun playing stylistically in this like punk rock domain, but it's kind of tough to really go out and sell like a joke. So, it's like we never intended to create like a Weird Al-esque career in the punk rock, arena, right? So our singer started changing the tone a little bit to something that had some substance, right? Because it's also tough if you're trying to go out there and really own it as a rock and roll frontman singing joke parody lyrics. Started switching that and saying, let's speak a little bit more honestly. And yeah, one thing led to another, but it all started very much centralized in our own community where we had all been playing in other bands throughout high school. So it was in no way intentional at first. And yes, our career has actually been, you mentioned taking a long-term approach, which I love to hear. It has been a slow burn and actually has allowed us to see very clearly a lot of other bands kind of do this like almost viral trending spike breakthrough and then kind of, go away. And the industry, there's a lot of different metric and cycles that you'll see, but I think there's probably a couple reasons why, there's many reasons anything can happen, right? There's a number of variables in this business, but there's a reason why, we have done this like the same original 6 members across, almost 2 decades where every record, and we still to this credit, think the rug is going to pull out. We're the same people that will sell out a venue and be like, are we sure that many people are coming? Like that's, even if it's a room in a city that we've done countless times before. So what I think then to answer the first part of your question, I love that case study, which also shout out Philly. Of course, it was somebody from Philly. I love that. And what I love is that whether it was the parents or her or everybody that was around her at such a young age, because I've also seen this, right? And my dad and I got really lucky to get involved like in a studio. My first band, actually, when my bass player and I were like 12, 13.
Wow.
Same bass player, actually, still in Wonder Years. This day, we've been playing music side by side almost like 2.5 decades now, which is pretty extreme and also very rare. And so I realized that we got some opportunities, not necessarily because, just like happenstance, someone that worked for my dad's business as a web developer happened to be like a world-class studio musician that knew this world-class guitar player. And we were far too young. It was way over our heads. But that person, who's a guitarist by the name of Greg Howe, actually, if anybody is a guitar player out there, look him up. It will mind blowing what that person can do. So to walk in there as a 14-year-old that could barely strum through a few chords and was trying to write, pop rock songs, it's kind of awe inspiring that he was even, entertaining it. Right. And so that never panned out on that band, obviously. But the idea that not only my dad, my parents, my mom, but people like him, instead of trying to like push us in, they really gave the freedom to say, hey, we can do this. We can cut a little demo for you guys. It'll be a long road. Or they could have just tried to like really bear down, own it and say, all right, well, you can't hang this. We're going to hire all new musicians to come in here, do everything. And, the songs are good, but we're going to rewrite them. And they approached it with the understanding that this was really just the start of something and not to try and hold it too tight. Now, it sounds like we were maybe not nearly as talented as this artist may have been, but we had people around us that realized that recognized that and recognized, hey, this is not going to be your first band. It's probably not going to be your second band, right? Let that develop, let it ruminate, and you will find your way naturally. And that was the first thing, which I think in order to being authentic, not finding yourself in a trap where you feel like you have been kind of pulled into a certain path and end up in a place where you're like, this seems nothing like what I want to be doing, right? And so I think really important to understand, rarely are you going to have that much success, number one, with what your first song out of the gate, right? But number two, when you do, there are 2 choices and say, hey, we can pour gasoline on this fire. And maybe that might create some really rash decisions and choices in the moment that you wouldn't otherwise want to make because you feel like you don't want to miss an opportunity. And I think having some of that time to weigh those opportunities, like us, we had time to kind of go gradually. It wasn't just play to no one and then all of a sudden arenas overnight or anything, which can also do some really extreme growth stunting, I think, emotionally,
Well, you hear about the TikTok artists who are not used to performing in front of live audiences and then have to go to performing Coachella. Like that was like last year, that was the big thing.
Know them. Yeah, totally. And so that's a problem I've watched a lot of people in the industry try to solve, Some of them sometimes come to me and be like, hey, this person's never had like a live guitar rig set up. Like, can you consult on this? And I'm happy to offer advice, but also I'm just like, well, there's a reason why there's a lot of other bands that spend like 15 years figuring out exactly what their sound is and how to do it live slowly but surely, right? But, all that's to say that I think zeroing in on making sure that artist, if they really want her to be the artist that she's meant to be for long term, there's no way she has her sound and those things figured figured out, they're figured out across albums and across hundreds of songs, right? So even like that song versus 10 more songs might be completely different, right? Like she might decide this is actually the way that I sing. We figured out in the studio across 10 songs that this little stylization is something I'm really good at and something that really is a signature moment, and start pulling that out. And that might be countered what would happen if you tried to get in there and recreate that kind of viral success, you know? But the other thing that you mentioned as well that I can quickly touch on in terms of community and bringing it to Reddit, and it's really funny when you put things out there, if you keep at it and keep trying to find different avenues, eventually you will start to realize that some doors open up, and rarely are they the doors that you think are going to open up, right? So all of these things where it just so happened that there was somebody in the community that was active on a Reddit board and was able to bring that to people at the right place and right time. So this is the other thing that I say. It's like, you have to realize that if you have one rigid path of how a promotion in terms of music or, you know, an album or a campaign should work, you have to be flexible and realize like it rarely is it going to be executed and follow all the way through that way.
Right.
And so you have to start to understand how to be malleable and go with some opportunities should they come up. Again, the obstacle is the way here, right? If you're not getting anybody answering, you know, with these cold calls and knocking at the door, start to understand what that might mean and say, hey, what if I do this completely differently and flip this campaign or flip this strategy on its head? Well, then you might just have a really interesting, disruptive approach to trying to promote your music that somebody would actually find interesting, you know? And I think that's where the good stuff starts to come up. And that's where that case study you mentioned might have been time and place, and people were really longing for that, you know, but then I would say it's like, well, then post-pandemic, I mean, like you're going to keep writing songs. They're going to keep being stories. It's more about the process and how you choose to lay them out and how you choose to pick those stories as an artist that I think are going to keep people invested ultimately in you and not just one song on a playlist somewhere, you know?
Right.
So that's also what I would caution. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and to that point, one of the other things that we did was one of my team loves Twitter, or did previously. Now, you know, we're not quite sure, but a lot of journalists and radio shows and different people are on Twitter. And so there was a radio show in England that was looking for new songs and new artists. And we were able to get her to do like a little opening intro for their Christmas program, which in England, Christmas is bigger than anywhere else, I think.
Well, actually, top 5 best movies ever made. Absolutely.
Yes. Yeah. So the fact that she got to do a little intro and then her song was played on the radio in England because we saw a tweet. Right. So the power of the internet and finding these ways to connect with your audience, but also with journalists. And this could work for not just music, but for any industry. If you're following the right people, you're looking at the right keywords on social, you can find those connections. And you can then, when it's the right time, you reach out. And the worst they can say is no, right? You don't know this person. So if they say no, there's no harm, but they could be a yes.
That's right.
And I also love the fact that you talked about like developing your career and how you all were able to really figure out who you wanted to be. Yeah. Right. And I think that, like you said, it changes over time, no matter what your business is. Even as a marketer, you know, first I was like, for this iteration of my career, okay, I'll just take any client. And then I had to hone in on like, no, this is my sweet spot. Yeah. And that can change over time. And so it's something that any business has to be cognizant of. Or like you were saying, like in 10 songs, she could really discover who she is. And that could be completely different than the first song that she put out.
Yeah. And I'll give you I always love using this analogy, especially when I'm in the studio with the band, trying to figure out like every decision seems so precious, right? And it is, right? And I also always say it's like nobody will ever care about your art as much as you.
Right.
The best you can do is go find a close second, right? And make that person your ally. So realistically, it's like I always talk in terms of albums, and there's a reason why we've been a band and our community and fan base really know us and really appreciate digesting our music as a whole album, because I think you can get really detailed and really powerful connections tied into an entire album, an entire collection of songs, more so than really maybe the story that you're able to tell with just one song, right?
You can tell a whole narrative.
You can juxtapose things. You can almost have scenes, different vignettes, reoccurring themes, lyrically, musically, which are all things that we do. And we are self-referential now because we have, 7+ studio albums, and there are callbacks on this album that we just put out 6 months ago, back to our first and second and third album. We're even talking about people don't even realize that we've done a series of like acoustic reimagined versions of songs over time. And we've put out 3 iterations, 3 volumes of what we call Burst and Decay. Wow. Guess what? If there's a 4th and somebody puts all 4 of those together, they're going to see something that we've been building for almost 10 years, right? And they don't even know that it's coming, you know? So cool. So it's thinking like that, where the power of longevity and what you can really do, those are the things that people are like, oh, they've had this idea and have been like working to make this moment for the last like 5 years. And the patience and like to get it, and the payoff is something that there almost really is no replacement for in terms of like an instantaneous. You have to have people invest in order to really have them, bring them along for that, in the same way you invest a lot of time into reading a very long novel. You know, you've been there, you've sat with those characters, you've sat with those scenes, you've sat with those emotions. So by the time you get to the end of it, that's why you close the book and you're like weeping and you're like, what, did they die? It's like, no, it's so much more than that. Like, you know, and you can't get the same version of that by reading the cliff notes of that book, you know, even though we thought we did when we were in junior high. Right. And I always think about how long I missed out on the nuance, all that residue, that great residue that all my like English teachers were trying to get us to like, realize so desperately. And they're like, yes, technically you live in this city. Okay, you didn't fail the quiz, right? But for us, it is that I think is so entrenched in people when they think about what we have tried to do. It's those things, even if they can't recall like one, you know, specific thing right off the bat, it's knowing that we are always thinking about that, thinking about an experience, thinking about a moment ahead of time, and how we can plan something really different that they haven't seen, whether it be in the genre or even from us, that might show a slightly different side of us. Yeah. It's evolved. And to see that and tell a young band who is like, this song has to be perfect, I'm going to bring in 100 producers to make sure, right? Also, shout out if anybody has seen the movie Popstar. We watch it at least 3 times a tour on the bus. We love it. Please, if this gets to Andy Samberg, let's be friends. Brooklyn Nine-Nine is amazing. But that is all to say that I always say time is an artist's most valuable resource, especially if you're independent, because the better you use it, the better you manage it, and the better you appreciate it and value it, the stronger you can become, and the quicker you can start to move, and the more intentioned your actions will be, right? In terms of building a brand, in terms of building a career, in terms of being responsible, you know, with money and making sound decisions. And yeah, time has afforded us that. And so I love the fact that everybody in that girl's corner said she needs to be the one to decide and do the work and figure out where she wants to go, you know. And I've worked with some artists that are probably just her age or younger, and I can look back at it's like, I know that they're trying to think in this one. It's like, you can't do the work that you're trying to do in just this one song. So just let's finish it. It can just be one song. And every time you write another, the percentage of what part of your brand and what part of your musical identity that makes up becomes a smaller and smaller piece. So just remember that and just keep going and be consistent about it. And you can build that library instead of just trying to make the perfect one book, right?
Right. Yeah. So besides, having your band, touring, making music, you're a producer, a mixing engineer, you work one-on-one now with coaching for select artists, and you also have a podcast. So
yes.
Wow.
A few hats. My hat rack is very large these days. Yes.
Did the podcast and the virtual coaching come out of the pandemic? Is that something that you started during that time, or?
Yeah, very much so. Well, I kind of spoke to a little bit of how the coaching came about, right? Yeah. Because it was already something I'd kind of been doing when working with artists that I was producing, who would inevitably come back and say, hey, you've kind of been doing this with a band for real. Like, what are your thoughts on how I should release it? All of the buzz questions, right? How do I get on playlists? How do I get more streams? Should I do a release show? Should I bother with that? Should I not? And then I have to kind of sit them down and say, hey, instead of me giving you like the yes or no answer to all of these, start asking better questions that have open-ended answers, and let's see where that takes you. And I can really give you some better ways of how to frame the questions and almost start to answer them for yourselves, because you're actually building a brand in that way, instead of just me giving you every answer, because then you'll just keep coming back and being like, raising my hand again, what's the answer to this one? Instead of, that's why now I look back and I appreciate the teachers and even some of the more stern mentors and music mentors that are just like, you got to go figure this out. Here's the progression. Here's the couple scales that you can venues, I can't write your solo for you. And I'm like, you're right. I have to figure that out and decide, right? And so that is where the coaching came from, right? And it's still really, in terms of, the metaphor of what we were just talking about, it feels like I'm only really just getting started, even though I've been doing it for a number of years now, interestingly enough, because I feel like that's just one lane where I can serve a lot of this next new generation of really smart. I mean, the next generation of the music business, it's just there's more opportunity than ever, but you have to be smarter and more focused than ever as well. Because if you aren't, there are just so many other people that are willing to go that extra mile, willing to learn a little bit more about how to effectively brand themselves, willing to learn about how to market themselves and pull from other non-music narrowed spaces and go out and bring those tools back. So I think there's a lot of other ways, many of them up as we speak, honestly, in various forms. But yeah, the one-on-one coaching has been really fulfilling because it allows me to be creative, right? So many of those decisions and conversations of how to do things uniquely, just like what I love about how to write songs and record them and then present them in a live setting, are also really creative when you get to build experiences out of those songs and around those songs, So that's really fun. And then the podcast, yeah, we had some downtime, and that was actually something that the studio that I built just outside Philadelphia in central Jersey, I went in with two friends that helped design the space and also work out of there. And the other is my co-host on the podcast, Tom Conran. And we, just like any true creative, just like I'm sure you get together, if it would have been a conference of some sort or somebody else that you've worked with that you just really love what you do and pick up and feed off of each other's energies, we do the same thing and talk about records, talk about the stories. It's like, oh, well, we heard this producer actually tracked this record this way, or that this artist, when they went to do this record, actually took this completely weird approach. And that's why it sounds the way it did. And it always fascinated us. So this was a journey where the show has also evolved into an interview-based format now, where each season almost mirrors a track listing of an album. We do it in 12-episode seasons. And in that way, it allows us to kind of present some interesting, really nice themes and ideas and takeaways. I've been an avid self-improver for the better part of my adult life. That's always the section that I gravitate towards. When I go to the bookstore, I want to learn new stuff. I want to get better. I want to figure out how to do the things that I'm doing and take information from other avenues and other areas. And this podcast, I realized I was every interview that I bring in, some people that I know, others that I don't, I can listen to their journey and then also have a chance to present that record to my audience if they don't know it, or if they do, serve it up in a completely different, deeper, richer context that when they go listen to it again, they have a newfound appreciation for the art and for everything that went into it and why it is as good and as powerful as it is. And I love it. It charges me up every interview I do, every time I go out. It keeps me going,
Yeah.
And I think there's so much to be said for that. And I'm really happy to say that even if nobody listened to it, I would still do it. But luckily, that is not at all the problem we're having. So, yeah.
Awesome. Good. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah.
So, Casey, I know that there are a lot of places I'm sure people can go to find you and what you're doing, and I'll put them in the show notes. But what's the top one or two places that you want people to go to?
Yeah, absolutely. The best place would be my website, which is just my name, CaseyCavaliere.com. There's a silent E on the end of Cavalier, as we were talking about earlier. And you can find everything there about, what I'm doing and all the various ways that I'm trying to give back and help bands and musicians just like myself, find their voice and find that long-term path and build that brand that really allows people to care about and invest in what they're making and what they're putting into the world. And beyond that, I'm probably most active when it comes to social media on Instagram at case_rock. I'm very much trying to do a better job in, like I said, always trying to grow, improve, and stretch, always trying to put some more videos that point back to some of the resources that I have on my website and blog out there in video form. And I don't always love the kind of hashtag tips or hacks fodder. I prefer to take an aim in building a cohesive philosophy that informs your decision making, as opposed to just kind of piecemeal piecemeal, picking out little toys and tools and stuff. But that is to say, they can be helpful too. And sometimes it's about putting it in digestible little like charcuterie size pieces. So if you're interested in any of that, you can go ahead and follow me on there. And that is about it. You can reach out to me on the website as well. And if anything about, building that kind of philosophy and asking better questions that can lead you to that kind of brand building framework interests you, you can go there and maybe I'll give you the link as well. And you can download my free artist strategy guide that's basically just took 15 of my favorite questions that I think are really important. Things like asking yourself why you're doing this, and getting past because it would be cool to be famous or because it would be cool to make a lot of money on. Right. That's not going to help you get through those like 6-month, 12-month, multi-year periods and the lulls where maybe that pandemic comes and you can't tour. You know what I mean? Like what's going to keep you going if just, that side of things was going, and that's going to really, again, guide you into a lot of other interesting areas and communities that you can maybe take your music, So you can download that at caseycavaliere.com/guide. And otherwise, reach out to me. I'm around, I'm available. I try and check my DMs, I'm always up for a great conversation, especially when it comes to branding or putting something together that is meaningful and putting it out into the world.
Fantastic. And do you have a favorite quote, mantra, some words that you live by?
Oh, wow. I probably have too many of them. Honestly. This isn't necessarily a quote, but, finding your tribe and the company that you keep, I think is really important to how we evolve as individuals and the things that we're making. So I'll say this as a person who's spent the better part of 2 decades with a group of the same 6 gentlemen in a band. I find this one highly applicable, and I do find it to be true. And I am very thankful for it to be so as well, that I think you're the sum of the 5 people you spend the most time with in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. So just be mindful and looking around of your like close circle, and whether it's feeding you energy or detracting energy from you, because if you have a lot of goals, but you don't have the right people around you, it's going to always feel like an uphill battle. But I think if you have the right people around you, you'll turn into the type of person that does create that business that you're thinking about, that does create that kind of lasting change. And it all kind of starts there, with the circle of people that you learn from, even when you're not thinking about it, So you're the sum of the 5 people. So just remember that. Look at your 5 people and what they're doing for you on a daily basis, and what you're bringing to them too, because I think we learn by teaching as well. So.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much. This was an awesome conversation. I think there are probably hours more that we could talk. I could ask you so many more questions that we didn't even get to, but
we'll pencil in a part 2 for next year.
Exactly. And also, everybody should go to The Record Process, listen to Casey's podcast as well, and just hear more interesting stories, find some new music, right?
Yes.
So, yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much. And to the audience, thank you for listening. I know that I got a lot of great tips that I could think about as general business tips, not just band business tips, but I also am like, okay, going through my Rolodex in my head of like, who should go on your podcast? Now I need to listen to that and see who I can pitch for that. And like what artists I know that are new artists that should work with you. That was really fun and exciting. And I will be back again in another few days. And until then, enjoy your week. Want more? Check out amplifywithannika.com or follow me on socials at amplifywithannika.